Your compassion is destroying you. Nobody will say that to your face. Every tragedy on your screen hits a part of your nervous system with zero defense. Those mothers in the catastrophe, their bodies kick in. Adrenaline, dissociation, others around them going through the same thing. You, sitting thousands of miles away, get the full blast with none of it. Your grandparents grieved local losses. You absorb the concentrated pain of an entire planet, served by algorithms built to keep you watching. What you call empathy has turned into something that eats you alive. And the part that should disturb you most, carrying that pain doesn't take a single gram off the world's suffering. It adds to it.
The law of attraction proves any position correct. The pessimist finds endless horror, the optimist endless beauty.
The real question isn't which is true. It's which one you've been practicing every single day without noticing.
There is a belief that sustains thousands of seekers around the world. A hope that hides beneath years of study, underlined books, late nights contemplating ideas that promise transformation. The belief is simple. With enough consciousness and well-designed systems, humanity could flourish, together, collectively. This faith fuels entire journeys, and then it crumbles. The moment of rupture rarely comes from a single event. It comes from accumulation, from observing patterns that repeat regardless of context, culture, or era. From perceiving that self-interest at the expense of others seems to govern everything, from corporate corridors to small everyday interactions. Political systems fail, economic systems concentrate, religious systems corrupt, philosophical systems become clubs of intellectual vanity. No system works, none ever has, none ever will. This conclusion carries brutal weight for those who dedicated genuine energy to the search. The cynicism of those who never tried hurts less. The disillusionment of those who truly believed that destroys from within. Literature captures this moment with surgical precision. In The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, there's a scene that has disturbed readers for decades. The protagonist takes the most exquisite piece of art, something of undeniable beauty, and hurls it down an elevator shaft. Deliberate destruction, calculated. Why would someone do this? The answer is uncomfortable, because sometimes destruction becomes the only honest response to a world that seems irredeemably corrupted. When beauty exists only to be appropriated, commodified, transformed into a status instrument for people who can't even perceive it, destroying it can feel like an act of integrity. A silent protest against the farce. This destructive impulse doesn't arise from nowhere. It's born from something we rarely admit out loud. Spending years saying hello to your own dreams with focus and conviction, while ignoring what actually exists, exacts a price. The philosophies of conscious creation, the law of attraction, manifestation, the power of intention offer genuine tools. They work. But they work within a context that these same philosophies frequently minimize. We live on a planet where children are systematically abused, where genocides happened, are happening, and will happen, where exploitation of the vulnerable constitutes not an exception, but an operational rule of entire civilizations. Calling all of this contrast, a single pleasant word begins to sound like an insult. The loss of hope arises from something more disturbing than an incorrect message or a personal incapacity. It arises from the perception that there's much more than this, that the individual universe of each manifestor coexists with an ocean of suffering upon which pretty words seem to float like irrelevant foam. Consider a real life, a life that self-help manuals prefer to ignore, a life with a childhood of abuse, the kind that leaves invisible marks that bleed for decades. An adult life punctuated by business failures, not from lack of effort, but from circumstances that seem to actively conspire against any progress. Betrayal by someone deeply loved, financial ruin, divorce. And then, as if that weren't enough, an avalanche of exploitation by people who identify vulnerability as opportunity, Now try to sustain an optimistic philosophy. The question demands an answer. How many people throughout history could maintain faith in the fundamental goodness of existence after going through something like this? What percentage of humanity possesses the psychological resilience, the internal resources, the external support necessary to emerge from decades of suffering, still believing that thoughts become things? Most spiritual philosophies avoid this question. They prefer to speak of inspiring exceptions, the survivors who transcended, the masters who found peace despite everything. But exceptions confirm rules, and the rule seems to be that prolonged suffering crushes most souls who traverse it. The tools of conscious creation work. Presenting them as a universal solution, however, reveals blindness, or worse, indifference, to the brutal complexity of human experience. Faith in systems collapses when we perceive that no system operates in a vacuum. Every system depends on people, and people, for the most part, operate from fears, deficiencies, and patterns they don't even recognize. Put unconscious people inside well-designed systems, and you get corrupted systems. Put conscious people inside flawed systems, and you get frustration and burnout. The chessboard is rigged against us, and yet something remains. The naive hope from before died and deserved to die. What survives is different, an uncomfortable curiosity, the suspicion that perhaps the error lies not in the tools, but in how we understand the game. This suspicion keeps us here. When you observe closely, really closely, without the filters that socialization imposes, a feeling emerges that few dare to admit. Disgust, the word is strong, uncomfortable, socially unacceptable, but it captures something that haunts the mind of anyone who looks without blinking at what really dominates human interactions. Ignorance cultivated as virtue, stupidity celebrated as authenticity. Tiny ambitions directed at shallow trenches of accumulation, money dug to create isolation, parades in tacky luxury that impresses only those who share the same inner poverty. Look around. Most people live trapped in existences that bear no resemblance to what they actually want, jobs that drain their energy, relationships built on obligation, routines that function as anesthesia, and worst of all, constant suffering as a result of others inserting themselves into their lives uninvited, abusive bosses, manipulative partners, systems that extract every last drop of energy before discarding them. This diagnosis sounds cynical, perhaps it is, but cynicism sometimes functions as defense against a reality that's difficult to process any other way. And then the hardest argument to answer emerges, the most brutal test for any philosophy that proposes conscious creation of reality. 6 million people died in the Holocaust. Men, women, children, shot, gassed, worked to death. How do you explain that all of them, every single one, were vibrationally compatible with this experience? The idea that each person attracts their reality through thoughts and feelings finds here its most disturbing limit. To say that a 5-year-old child walking to a gas chamber attracted that experience through their personal vibration, this sounds like intellectual obscenity. A theory that needs to explain this kind of reality either becomes irrelevant or becomes monstrous. And the Holocaust represents just one example among many. Genocides happened before, they happened after Cambodia, Rwanda, Armenia. The list extends across centuries and continents, millions of people in each event. Each one with an inner life, dreams, fears, hopes, all converging toward experiences of unimaginable horror. History will repeat itself. This conclusion weighs like lead, but evidence supports it. Wars will dominate again. Some group will be dehumanized. Some ideology will justify atrocities. Some charismatic leader will channel collective resentments into organized violence. The cycle seems inscribed in the very nature of things, a pattern that transcends cultures, eras, and political systems. Denying this would be naivety, or worse, complicity with an irresponsible optimism that closes its eyes to the overwhelming evidence of systematic and organized suffering that defines much of the experience on this planet. The objection arises immediately, but what about the advances? The reduction of extreme poverty, the rights won, the increasing life expectancy? These data points exist, they're real, but they coexist with other equally real data. The capacity for mass destruction has increased exponentially. Nuclear weapons remain in silos, waiting. Climate change threatens population displacements that would pale any previous migratory crisis. And new instruments of control and manipulation, algorithmic, biological, psychological, emerge faster than our ability to understand them. Progress and regress walk side by side. They always have. This places us in an uncomfortable position. If we accept that the law of attraction operates as a universal principle, we need to explain how it applies to collective suffering of historical proportions. If we reject this law completely, we lose a tool that, despite its limitations, demonstrates effectiveness at the individual scale. The temptation is to choose a side, defend the law with caveats that become increasingly elaborate, or attack it as a comforting illusion for the privileged who've never faced real adversity. Both positions offer intellectual comfort, and both avoid the tension of holding two apparently contradictory truths simultaneously. The world contains genuine, systematic, repetitive horror, and attention shapes individual experience in measurable ways. These two statements can coexist. The question is how. When we observe children in war zones, images that cross our news feeds with disturbing regularity, we feel something beyond compassion. We feel a kind of moral vertigo. How can this exist? How do we allow this to continue existing? What does the infinite repetition of these patterns say about our species? These questions have no easy answers. Perhaps they have no answers at all, at least not the kind that satisfies the rational mind seeking clean explanations for dirty phenomena. What we have is a choice about what to do with this knowledge. We can allow it to paralyze us. We can use it as justification for giving up. We can transform it into cynical armor that protects us from future disappointments. Or we can look deeper, because there's something we haven't yet considered. A perspective that validates every dark observation made so far without agreeing with the conclusion that these observations represent the totality of the story. A perspective that recognizes horror without allowing it to define the limits of the possible. This perspective demands attention. A mature response to this despair begins with an acknowledgement. Any reasonable mind would agree with much of what's been said. There are horrendous acts happening now as these words are being read. Unjust, unthinkable, unspeakable behaviors are unfolding in some corner of the planet at this exact moment. Using more words than contrast to describe this seems fair, necessary even. The contrast in this world reaches immense proportions. When we say we live in the best of times and worst of times, the phrase carries more literal truth than Charles Dickens imagined when he wrote it. Contrast increases continuously. The capacity to inflict pain and damage grows with each technological advance. Armed drones, mass surveillance, increasingly sophisticated chemical weapons. A single individual today can cause destruction that entire armies of the past couldn't achieve. But the capacity to find love and harmony also grows. Information flows. Communities form across oceans. People who would never have met now discover they share visions, values, dreams. Healing happens. Awakening happens. Genuine connections multiply at unprecedented speed. Both things grow simultaneously. They always have. When we're part of a world with access to so much information and so much detail about others' suffering, it seems foolish to bury our heads in the sand. Pretending that unspeakable things haven't happened or aren't happening now, that would be intellectual dishonesty. Because the truth is, they are happening, all around, all the time. While we live our relatively protected lives, others traverse hells our imagination can barely touch. Recognizing this matters, but recognizing something differs from allowing that something to define the limits of entire reality. There's a knowledge that changes the equation, an understanding that wisdom traditions have preserved through millennia, expressed in different languages but pointing to the same truth. Every consciousness inhabiting a human body came to this experience with some degree of foreknowledge about what it would find here. The expectation was never of a resolved paradise. Problems would be part of the package, and this was desired, not feared. This understanding provokes immediate resistance. It sounds like justification for suffering, cosmic rationalization for injustice, a way to absolve perpetrators and blame victims. But the resistance is born from confusion. Saying someone deserved to suffer is cruel. Recognizing that the consciousness inhabiting that body chose to participate in a game where suffering constitutes one of the possibilities is descriptive. The difference between these two statements matters. No one would have come if there had been the promise of a world without choices. This point deserves attention because it carries profound implications. If every consciousness present here chose to participate in an experience where horror exists as a possibility, then something in that consciousness valued participation more than it feared the risk. Something understood that contrast, however brutal it might be, offered expansion opportunities unavailable in safer realities. Does this sound too abstract? Consider for a moment the games humans invent for themselves. Extreme sports where death is a real possibility. Ventures where financial ruin lurks behind every decision. Relationships where emotional devastation always remains a risk. Why do we voluntarily expose ourselves to these possibilities when we could choose more protected paths? Because something in us recognizes that the intensity of experience justifies the risk. Scale this up to the cosmic level, and the logic remains the same. A consciousness that has never experienced contrast can exist, but existing doesn't equal living. Contrast offers something that static perfection could never provide, the possibility of genuine choice, of real preference, of movement toward the desired from the clarity that only the undesired provides. The suffering remains undesirable. What changes is that it becomes comprehensible within a larger context. The mother who loses a child didn't consciously choose that loss. The torture survivor didn't wake up one day deciding, "Today, I'll be brutalized." The choice operates at a level prior to the consciousness we identify as I. It operates in the consciousness that decided to participate in a game where these experiences exist as possibilities, knowing that resources would also exist to navigate whatever arose. These resources exist. The question is whether we can access them when we most need them. The central paradox remains: if everything is choice at some level, why does it seem so impossible that someone would choose the most horrendous things for themselves? When you live through unwanted things, belief in free will becomes almost impossible to sustain. Observe someone traversing a sequence of devastating losses, a terrible diagnosis followed by abandonment, financial ruin followed by betrayal, physical pain followed by emotional isolation. With each new blow, the notion that this person is creating their reality sounds increasingly absurd, more cruel even. How can you believe that someone would choose something horrendous for themselves? This difficulty carries legitimacy. No one in their right mind would wake up saying, "Today I'll attract catastrophe into my life." No one desires suffering for the pleasure of suffering. The conscious mind, that part of us we identify as I, which plans, decides, evaluates, would never voluntarily opt for torment. But the conscious mind represents only a fraction of what we are. The problem lies in something we rarely consider. The choices that shape our experience operate mostly outside the consciousness we call I. Thought patterns repeated thousands of times until they become automatic. Emotional responses conditioned since childhood. Beliefs absorbed from the family environment that were never examined. Fears that govern decisions without even being recognized as fears. These forces operate continuously, silently, and they produce results. When the result emerges, it seems to come from outside. It seems like something was done to us, not by us. The reason for this perception is simple. We don't recognize the contribution because we don't perceive the process. It's like blaming the mirror for the reflected image when we didn't see the face that approached it. The natural reaction when facing apparently inexplicable suffering is to seek external causes. There must be some source of darkness operating in the world, some malevolent force that chooses victims arbitrarily, some entity, human or otherwise, responsible for distributing suffering among the innocent. Or perhaps there's a cosmic debt being collected, karma from past lives, sins of ancestors visiting subsequent generations, some type of universal accounting that balances accounts in ways we don't understand. These explanations offer comfort. They preserve innocence. If suffering comes from outside, from malevolent forces, from cosmic debts, from cruel randomness, then we remain victims. And victims carry no responsibility for what happens to them. But this position, despite being comforting, has a high cost: total powerlessness. If external forces govern our destiny, no internal change can alter what we experience. We become hostages to powers we don't control, hoping that luck changes or some divinity intervenes in our favor. Life becomes a lottery. We win or lose, depending on factors completely beyond our influence. The understanding that liberates requires something more difficult: accepting that there's a connection between what we think, how we feel, and what we experience. This connection operates through mechanisms the conscious mind doesn't perceive. Repeated thought generates an emotional state. The emotional state creates a pattern of vibration, to use the language of these traditions. The vibration pattern attracts compatible experiences. The cycle feeds back continuously. Observing this cycle in operation requires attention that few dedicate. Most of us live so immersed in the automatic flow of thoughts and reactions that we never notice the pattern. It's like a fish trying to perceive water. The medium is invisible precisely because it's constant. When we begin to make the association, when we notice that certain repeated thoughts precede certain types of experience, something changes. We gain some understanding of the mechanism, and this understanding, though partial, opens a door. If we can see the cycle operating in ourselves, we can begin to perceive how it operates in others. The mother who grew up in scarcity and spent her life fearing poverty, we observe how this fear shaped her decisions, her relationships, her financial experience. The father who never processed the rage from his own childhood, we see how this unresolved anger created exactly the kind of conflict he consciously wanted to avoid. The connection between thought, feeling, and result is the key that most ignore or refuse to accept. They refuse because accepting implies responsibility. And responsibility, when misunderstood, seems synonymous with blame. Saying, "You created this," sounds like, "You deserve this." But unconscious creation and deliberate choice occupy distinct territories. Responsibility and blame do as well. Understanding the mechanism offers something victimization never will: the possibility of change. If the pattern of thought and feeling contributes to the pattern of experience, then altering one can alter the other. Not instantaneously, not magically, but gradually through consistent attention to what we practice internally. This possibility represents genuine hope, not the passive hope that awaits external intervention, but hope born from the recognition of agency, even if that agency operates in layers we've barely begun to explore. What comes now provokes immediate resistance. Every fiber of cultural conditioning rises in objection before even processing the words. The biggest blind spot in this entire understanding involves something we rarely examine with honesty. The horror we attribute to the experience of death doesn't correspond in any way to what we imagine. This statement requires context. Cultures around the world have built elaborate systems of terror around the end of physical life. Religions threaten with eternal hells. Secular societies treat death as the ultimate failure, something to be avoided, postponed, denied until the last possible moment. The very word carries weight. Saying it aloud in certain contexts generates visible discomfort. But this terror constitutes cultural construction, not universal truth. Observe animals. They offer a perspective that our species lost at some point along the way. Animals come and go with a fluidity that humans can barely comprehend. They're born, live intensely for their characteristic periods, and depart without the existential drama we project onto the process. A 15-year-old dog doesn't spend its last months in anguish about mortality. A bird doesn't construct philosophies about the meaning of finitude. This happens because animals reach levels of maturity much more easily than humans. They remain connected to the natural rhythm of existence without the interference of obsessive abstract thought. The joy animals feel during their lives is proportionally greater than most humans experience. They live in the present with an intensity we consider impossible. And even when they reach what our perspective would consider a terrible end, predation, disease, accident, this end represents a brief moment relative to the predominantly delicious experience that constitutes their lives. We've lost this proportion. The human tendency is to not allow this understanding because our mind remains too busy. We speculate incessantly about what went wrong. We replay scenarios. We imagine sufferings. We construct horror narratives that often exceed in intensity the actual experience of the being who went through the transition. This speculation keeps us in internal conflict with the well-being that life naturally offers. The objection arises immediately, and it's valid. The problem with death, it's argued, doesn't necessarily reside in the experience itself. It resides in the damage caused, in the unfinished business, in the children left behind, in the destroyed families, in the ruined lives of those who remain, in the experience of loss that survivors carry, sometimes for decades. This objection deserves to be honored because it points to something real. The pain of loss exists. The void left by someone who departed exists. The practical consequences, financial, emotional, logistical, of an unexpected death exist and affect real people in profound ways. But observe what happens in this objection. The focus shifts from the person who died to the people who remained. The horror attributed to death belongs, in large part, to the observers, not to the being who traversed the experience. We assume, through our attention to details, the burdens of discomfort from the lives of so many over whom we have no creative control. The darkness we feel, the horror, the injustice, the tragedy, emerges largely from our own impossibility of doing something about it. We feel pain because we care. We feel anger because we want things to be different. We feel despair because our capacity to influence others' experience finds limits we refuse to accept. This mechanism operates in subtle ways we rarely examine. When we think about a child who died tragically, what exactly disturbs us? the child's experience during the event, or our own incapacity to have prevented it, to have protected, to have done something. Frequently, the suffering we feel connects less to what the child experienced and more to what we experience when contemplating that reality. This sounds cold, calculating, inhuman perhaps, but recognizing the mechanics of suffering doesn't diminish compassion. It can, in fact, refine it. When we understand that a significant part of our pain comes from the powerlessness we feel, not from the other's actual experience, we can direct this energy more usefully. We remain capable of honoring memory, of supporting survivors, of working to prevent future tragedies. These constructive actions remain available. What changes is the internal posture. We stop carrying weight that belongs to others, weight our attention assumed without necessity. This distinction between active compassion and destructive absorption prepares the ground for understanding something even more disturbing. The observer can, in certain circumstances, suffer more than the one who directly lives the experience. A woman was watching television. On the screen, images of a traumatic event in another part of the world. Children involved, mothers lamenting in a language she didn't understand, but whose meaning was universal. She became completely disturbed. The question arose naturally: if I feel so much discomfort watching something from which I'm so completely removed, separated by oceans, cultures, circumstances, what must it be like for those people who are in the middle of all that? Their suffering must be thousands of times worse than mine. The answer she received inverts everything our intuition suggests. Your pain in this moment is greater than theirs. The statement shocks because it contradicts our basic logic about suffering. How can someone sitting comfortably in their living room be experiencing greater pain than mothers who lost children in violent circumstances? The idea seems absurd, offensive even. But consider the mechanism for a moment. The contrast between who that woman is, her values, her compassion, her sense of justice, and what she was allowing to enter her experience through those images created a massive internal discord. She carried, in that moment, the emotional weight of thousands of stories condensed into minutes of footage, carefully edited to maximize impact. Meanwhile, the people in the middle of the situation were operating with different mechanisms, coping mechanisms that activate when experience is direct, adrenaline that numbs, focus on immediate actions that suspends reflection, community of others going through the same thing that offers support impossible to replicate from a distance, protective dissociation that the psyche triggers automatically in extreme situations. These mechanisms exist for a reason. They evolved over millions of years to allow conscious beings to traverse experiences that would otherwise be intolerable. They work. They operate silently, behind the scenes of consciousness, regulating what we can process and when. The observer from afar doesn't have access to these mechanisms. The observer receives emotional impact without any of the protections operating in those who live directly. They carry the weight of millions of stories because modern media allows exactly that without possessing any means of action that transforms this weight into something useful. They feel the pain, but the pain leads to nothing. It just hurts. The suffering of those who live the experience directly remains real and relevant. The point is different. Assuming upon ourselves the discord and discomfort of millions of people resolves absolutely nothing. It only multiplies misery in the world. It adds more suffering to already existing suffering without reducing a single gram of the original. The central question becomes inevitable. What is the work that truly belongs to each of us? The answer these traditions offer surprises with its simplicity. Illuminate the well-being of this planet. Practice what is desired, peace, connection, joy, purpose, with such deep attention that it reverberates through your entire being. Make this practice so consistent that it becomes the chronic point of attraction. Burying your head in the sand can be good if the alternative is focusing on something that causes attraction of more unwanted things. Ignorance can function as blessing when attention to the unwanted makes you practice a vibration that attracts more of what you want to avoid. This perspective seems selfish, instruction to ignore others' suffering in the name of inner peace, justification for indifference. But look more closely. Chronic despair contributes little to relieving the world's suffering. Paralysis before the weight of all imaginable tragedies rarely finds energy for constructive action, and internal discord practiced as solidarity with those who suffer only adds more discord to the collective field. In contrast, someone who deliberately cultivates states of well-being becomes capable of genuine action. They find clarity to identify where their contribution makes real difference. They possess energy to sustain efforts that require consistency. They transmit, through their simple presence, a frequency that offers counterweight to the horror that others choose to transmit. The choice between knowing what you know and living in joy, or knowing what you know and living in misery, remains exactly that, a choice. And the law of attraction will prove either position correct. The pessimist will find infinite evidence that the world confirms their pessimism. The optimist will find equally infinite evidence that the world confirms their optimism. Both will be right within their own experiences. Which perspective is true in some absolute sense? This question misses the point. The question that matters: which perspective do you choose to practice? This choice represents the only real power each consciousness possesses in this experience. External forces cannot impose a perspective against your continued will. Circumstances don't compel specific interpretations. The point of attention belongs to you, and what flows from that point shapes everything you experience. We've developed audio tools based on calibrated frequencies to facilitate exactly this shift in attention point. To create conditions where the choice for well-being becomes easier to sustain. To access these states and have immediate practical guidance, click the link on the screen or in the comments. If this video resonated with you, write in the comments, "It made sense to me."